All right, thank you. So I'm Mike Keyes. We were brought on really at that point, as Peter was suggesting, after the outline planning application process. And I think, as Peter said, Countryside were quite brave in a way to select architects and to give us some headspace to design a scheme. And that's not as common as you might think. And so there was a really critical point where we were asked to really start from scratch and to sort of rethink this project within those planning constraints. And the first thing I was going to mention really is that there's one of us missing. So when we started the process of redesigning the scheme, we worked with Grant Associates landscape architects, and they came on right at the beginning of the process. And again, for a housing development, that's relatively uncommon, or was at the time anyway. And that was really in response to this amazing structure of the existing tree belts and the existing landscape of the site. And that was the thing that really jumped out to everybody when we first went there, this incredibly strong set of avenues of trees through the scheme, and a real desire to work with those. And there's been some interesting research after this, really, about the value, the actual financial value of trees in housing developments. And so the landscape was really fundamental. So the master plan that I'm going to just talk through now started with a discussion between us and Andrew Grant. And Andrew's colleague, Peter Schmiel, actually came down and drew all of the trees. There's a lot more of these drawings, really, to sort of analyse the character of the place. And thinking about, this sort of wide range of species. Of course, we're right near to the botanical gardens, and it really is almost like an arboretum in itself. So very early on, there was an idea about living in a garden, living in a landscape, and about how the position of the house was part of a bigger picture. And that hopefully you'll see as we go through, that actually sort of follows through the design of all the buildings as well. So the relationship between building, between house, and between the communal and private gardens is really fundamental. And there's a local context, and of course there's a relationship to the immediate surroundings, and also a pretty critical relationship in many ways to London, with the railway being so close. So, there's a context there that's really important when you look at the sort of housing that we were asked to develop. And Grant did a load of work developing a whole set of garden spaces, really, a framework within which we would build houses, thinking about routes around the site, a jogging route, a walking route, somewhere to take the dog, somewhere to go and play with your kids, or just spaces that you could sit out in as a community. And so there's this really lovely structure of spaces that they worked through with us. And as I say, part of the response in terms of building was, traditional housing is often, Victorian housing particularly, is often a bit like this, a 6-metre wide plot, 20 metres, 15 metres maybe deep, house, garden, maybe a terrace in between, perhaps a little structure down the back here. And we thought, well, if we've got all of this wonderful communal space, this opportunity to create a new landscape to live in, what would we do to our houses? What if we compressed them? What if we made them much more compact and actually create sort of much more defined pockets of external space related to rooms, and then let the residents use those spaces and then benefit from more communal space? So that was a kind of fundamental idea for the beginning of the project. And this diagram, we sort of call this urban rugs on a carpet of landscapes. The idea was that you had very dense blocks of accommodation. So the structure that Peter and his colleagues had set out, we kind of enhanced that, took it a stage further, really making the buildings very compact in order to maximise the amount of space that sits between and around them. And so just very quickly, the structure of the master plan. So we had a very simple road layout, and as Peter said, there was a real desire to connect in here with the road, but for various reasons we weren't able to do that. So we had we simplified the route. We tried to work with straight avenues of streets. And we overlaid that with sort of what we call muse streets. I mean, most of them are sort of muse streets, so very tight urban spaces between buildings. We then overlay a sort of pedestrian route network that connects all those together with some big pieces of simple landscape as well. And develop some sort of more bespoke sort of garden spaces, communal garden spaces between and around the blocks of houses. And then finally, enhancing those kind of big avenues of trees, so going back to where we started. So that was how the master plan really evolved. And then we had to think about, how would we fit a range of buildings. In fact, the brief we had from Countryside early on was almost as many variants as you can fit on site. We ended up with, I think there's something like 20 odd different house types. So it's sort of a big range of different types of dwellings. So we had to think about how we would structure those on site. So the idea essentially was responding to some of the constraints on the boundary to Shaftesbury Road and Brooklands Avenue with semi-detached houses. Actually, there was a legal constraint that meant we had to do that. So quite large semi-detached houses. And then larger sort of villas, which are actually apartment buildings. So bigger buildings sitting in locations where they can benefit from more space, particularly around the heart of the scheme and around the brook edge, with a sort of more of a kind of wetland landscape. And then down the central avenue, so this is obviously the main road into the site, the main street in the site, a larger set of terraced houses, so quite sort of traditional in a way, 3-4-story terraced houses. And then sort of sitting in between all of that, in the areas in between the edges, we have what we kind of collectively termed courtyard houses. They're sort of courtyard houses. Now, of course, there's quite a big history of courtyard houses, some in Cambridge, but particularly in Scandinavia. So there are references there as well to architectural references. So there was a structure to the master plan. But early on, through the process, we felt that it would be more interesting to generate more variety within the scheme. So we actually suggested to Countryside that perhaps we could bring on some other architects to work with, which is a bit unusual, and I think probably fair to say raised some eyebrows. And in the end, we actually, I think initially we brought you guys on under our appointment, effectively, because it's easier that way. But we thought it was a great idea. We like working with other architects rather than just doing everything in one hand. We already had a desire for a big range of buildings, but want to go a bit further and try and get some real sort of variety in through who's designing buildings. And actually, if you think about most parts of the city, most parts of any city, buildings are designed in relatively small, historically relatively small pieces. So we brought these guys in, and we thought it would be quite nice to have a sort of structured way of doing that. So rather than saying, well, look, Richard, why don't you just do that corner over there? And Alison and Michael, why don't you do this bit over here? We said, well, let's actually design that. So what we did in the end is we asked Richard to look at this big terrace running through here and the kind of southern boundary. Michael and Alison to look at 3 buildings that were sort of interspersed. And then we just did the blocks in between. So that was quite an interesting process, and it, I think, did add a lot of richness. It made the process quite fun as well, which was very nice for us. And I don't think it caused too many problems for the developer. Okay. This is the affordable housing. Peter mentioned this. I've added this slide in, actually, because I thought it might just be worth touching on. There are issues with the way the affordable housing is integrated, largely around the desire for the housing association to have discrete blocks that they could manage. Now, of course, also the brief for a lot of the houses was for quite relatively high space standards. So 3-bed houses in here, typically about 130 square metres. That's bigger than the housing associations wanted for their brief. And so there's automatically a difference in type of building you have to design for that. So we had some sort of smaller courtyard house types we designed for that. And then Richard designed some interesting split houses. So some of the larger houses at the southern end of the site are actually multiple sort of duplexes. But the good thing I think about it was that they were built early on. So although the Sterling Prize focused on phase 1, which is really this group of houses up here, And actually that was our primary involvement, really, was for that first phase. These buildings already existed at the same time. So although I don't think they were referred to as Sterling Prize, but they were there when the judges came around. The community was there, which is the important thing. And more important than that, the community was there early on. So it was an integrated community from the beginning, rather than the affordable housing happening much later in the scheme, which could have been perhaps more of an issue. So I think there were some good things, even though there are some perhaps limitations in house planning. So that's the master plan. Quite ordered, straight roads, quite simple facades really, but broken down with a lot of variety of buildings. And as I say, there were quite a lot of different buildings in the design, making life very difficult for ourselves. But I think that the big advantage is it meant that there was a good range of buildings to sell for the developer, and we could respond to different parts of the scheme. So bigger houses for certain areas, smaller houses where there was a tighter grain, the bigger buildings onto the bigger landscape spaces. So I'm just going to go through just a few slides of the courtyard house type. So for us, I think these are the most interesting house types that we worked on in the development, and largely because of the relationship, I think, between private space and public space and shared space. So this is a model, quite an early sort of development model of the houses that are quite sort of quite often featured in photographs around one of the what are called street gardens, so one of the communal gardens. So these are the houses with the big chimneys. And as you can see, they're sort of quite intricate, three-dimensional volumes. So typically you have a sort of courtyard space on the ground floor with living accommodation next to it. You have a combination of living and bedroom accommodation on the first floor, and then you have a sort of almost like a penthouse bedroom accommodation on the top floor, each floor having some external space to open out onto. So that's a plan of actually that's the slightly larger version, the 4-bed version of those houses. And one of the critical things is that connected courtyard on the ground floor where you park your car. And for us, the critical thing is it connects through the space from one side of the house to the other. So you can see that in this sketch section. So here we have a Mews Street, another Mews Street on that side, and then the street garden in the middle. You're looking back towards that central avenue of trees. So these big trees are the ones that run down the middle of the site. Richard's terrace of houses in the background. And then you can see these two houses that sit opposite this space, almost creating a sort of valley of space with garden, courtyards, and then this communal space in the centre. This is one of Andrew Grant's sketches, just thinking about that space, those series of spaces, and how that space could work. And there was quite a lot of landscape detail in the buildings when they were built. So each of the houses had landscape planted as part of the perimeter of the house. So they weren't just houses left in a slightly muddy field with a road. The landscape was invested in quite heavily, and that's again, I think, a really important part of that sort of that really initial attraction of the scheme, that day one attraction of the scheme. So there's a lot of detail in designing the spaces in between. So again, one of Grant's sketches. So this is a typical kind of Mews Street. The houses we're talking about over on the left-hand side. Here we're looking to the back towards Brooklands Avenue. And then on the opposite side of those houses, the garden space, and the garden space which is a communal garden space. And actually, these spaces are managed by the residents who live either side, so there's some of the spaces are managed landscapes, which gives people a bit of ownership of that space. And this space has tables and benches and sort of productive landscape, almost like little allotment boxes in it. So to try and encourage people to get out and use the space. And incorporates play areas for small children, so again, it's part of the sort of family life of the scheme. And another characteristic, I suppose, of the scheme is that we've got a lot of buildings that come right up to the boundary of their sites and often have quite large windows. And that was probably thought of as a bit of a risk. So as you're walking, as a member of the public, maybe walking through this garden, you're looking directly into the family space, the family room. And actually, interestingly, people have managed that in different ways. Some people have blinds, some people don't, some people leave the windows more open. But there seems to be quite a good natural relationship between people walking past, not sort of sticking their nose up against the glass and peering in. A little bit like designing shared space, and there was an element of sort of shared space design in the public realm, in the road design. But this is a slightly different way of looking at it, I suppose. And these courtyard houses kind of contain life. So as you look down these gardens, the gardens are all very designed, but actually inside the courtyard of the house, you have a real variety of life with people sort of using those spaces in all sorts of different ways, which is really fantastic. You know, washing, swings, lots of bicycles. This one has AstroTurf in it. All really interesting stuff. And I think these spaces have become really popular, and particularly in incorporating things like bikes. And obviously Cambridge is very well known for a cycling culture. How could we enhance that? Well, making bikes easy to get at was a kind of key thing. So being able to just leave them out in your courtyard, so you almost trip over them outside your door, seems we've got a good way of making people think about using their bike. And then these garden spaces that provide sort of small-scale opportunities to get out of your house, get a bit of air, and to plant things. And this one is amazing. I mean, you know, the guys who own this house have just gone to town. And the landscape quality just sort of develops through the scheme, which is, for us, really exciting. You know, rooftop greenhouses built in, all by the residents, all these additions, if you like. And I think the idea of the buildings was to have a simple structure to it, so that the master plan itself is a very simple structure. Similarly, the buildings are quite robust, quite simple, and can adapt and can take some change. And I think as you go around, you'll see quite a few houses people have adapted them, although there are some controls, as Peter's saying, but people are still able to adapt to their space. And we think that's a very positive thing. I'll try and speed up a bit. We're running short of time. I do love this photo, Ben. This is one that Paul sent us, I think, of a cricket match on the green. And I'm pretty sure this was with a real cricket ball.
No, it's slightly soft.
No, slightly soft cricket ball, I guess. I always tell people it's a real cricket ball because of the glass. But you know, there's sort of level of community engagement early on in the project. This was, you know, pretty soon after the first phase was completed. We think it's quite unusual. And it could well be that that's because all you guys in Cambridge are lovely people and you all get on very well. We like to think that maybe the development has something to do with it as well. And, you know, they photograph really well, which is good for us. I'm going to pass over to Richard now, which is going to talk about the larger terrace.